Rachel, thank you so much for being here today.
It's a pleasure.
Rachel, I know that you are a survivor of satanic ritual abuse and other abuses, and I really thank you for coming on today to share your story. This is something that has been going on for far too long, and far too many children have been put through this, and it's something that most people are not aware of. So I really appreciate that you're willing to step up and tell your story and shed some light on this practice so that we can eradicate it here on this planet. So
I like the sound of that. It'd be nice to eradicate it.
yeah. I mean, that's one of my agendas as well, having, being a survivor myself. So Rachel, why don't you tell me your story, your background? Where did you grow up, and what kinds of things happened to you?
Okay, so I grew up in Adelaide in South Australia in the 1970s and 80s. So I was born in 1973. My main perpetrator was my father. We had a very interesting location where I grew up in Edwardstown in Adelaide, South Australia. So my father's built his home over what was once a Wunderlich's brick kiln, which became a gold store, and then later, with a 1938 mandate prior to World War II, tunnels were built between all of the old brick kilns in the area, so that there was a whole network of tunnels leading to these bunkers underground, and my father built his house on top of one of the bunkers. I've proven the existence of the bunker. The tunnel was exposed recently, the one closest to my house. I already had a title from 1955, a property title that proved the tunnel was there. But when the house was demolished, a dear person went and took footage, and you can see the tunnel. You can see that it's 3 feet deep underground, and you can see the top of it, and that they had shoved a whole bunch of stuff from the building excavation or destruction and shoved that into the tunnel. I have titles that show where the tunnel goes in that area. I also have done a great deal of extensive research to prove the existence of all the other tunnels that I was taken through, because it wasn't just those smaller tunnels closer to my home, that it extended out into stormwater tunnels and to other locations. And I would be taken through those as a child to other locations and used as a honeypot. So there were times where I was filmed or photographed with men that were clearly not conscious, in compromising positions, which I feel very guilty about, because I know some of those men weren't complicit. But also there was a lot of other full-on sexual abuse by my father and his friends, one of which was a chief inspector of police at that time, or he was, at least in the 80s he was, when he was abusing me, and another girl who was supposedly missing, but he knew where she was because he was abusing her. My father had extensive filming equipment. He always had very good cameras. He even had, the equipment, the big umbrella, that would deflect light or reflect light. And so there was a lot of child porn that was produced beneath my house. So it wasn't just the bunker, but there was also a cellar beneath the house where this activity would occur. I mean, he would abuse me above ground as well, but a lot of it was underground. And I think probably a lot of your viewers would be aware of the McMartin preschool case, where a lot of those abuses occurred underground, and you can discredit whoever says anything about it because it's happened underground. So that's my experience.
Rachel, I know about tunnels because I was transported from a torture facility underground in Rome to the Vatican, to the sub-levels of the Vatican, through a tunnel. It even had its own train that went, from one to the other. So I'm actually aware that these tunnels exist all over the world. So I'm not at all surprised to hear that. And you said that you were used as a honeypot. I know what that means, but if, in case people who are watching don't know what that means, could you describe that?
Sure. So I'm so sorry for what you've been through. So my father was an ASIO operative. So ASIO was a version of MI5 or MI6 or your CIA. And he would involved extensively in blackmail operations. So as a honeypot, I was just a small young underage girl that would be placed in positions with powerful or men that he wanted to have control over, naked, and the man would be naked, and I would be forced to perform whatever sexual act he wanted me to perform on that person, so that he could then film it and then own that person. Yeah. So yeah, and so my abuse included the child porn, the honeypot operations. I was abused by people very close to him. I was also under the MK Ultra program, so there was a psychologist in the family who was also extensively involved with that. I was trained psychically from an early age, but I mean, there was that ability on both sides of the family. So yeah, so I was used in that way, and also I was medically experimented on. Oh. So and the Satanic Ritual Abuse as well. So there were rituals that I was taken to. I witnessed the murders of children and a baby. Yeah, just wow. Yeah.
You know, unfortunately I know exactly what you're talking about. I witnessed the same, and you know, you're essentially saying some of the same things that I went through. And you know, I was going through this in Italy, and you were going through this in Australia. So clearly, this is a global phenomenon. And I also was experimented upon in the facility that my uncle ran underground in Rome. It's interesting for me to meet someone else who has gone through that. And I wonder if it's okay with you, would you be willing to go a little deeper into what that is and what you went through?
Okay, so I mean, one of my very first memories is very, very small. I think I was under 2. And of course, there'll be people who say, well, you can't remember anything below that age. And actually, that's really interesting, because that was actually my father's reaction when a sibling said to him, why did this happen to Rachel? He said, she wouldn't remember that. All psychologists are in agreement that no children remember anything under a certain age. So that was his reaction. Not, oh, no,
that's not true. And yet that's not
nothing
true.
Like that. So that one of that first memory, or one of the first memories, was being taken to a house which was located very close by to a butcher, which was a lot of dreadful things that happened at the butcher later on, well, actually previous and after. But I was taken there, and what looked like a doctor, it was dressed up like a doctor. This was just a house, mind you. This was not a medical facility that I was aware of, although there was a nurse that seemed to be running the show in the waiting room. I was taken into this room that looked like a suburban kind of room, and this doctor-looking person and 5 or 6 other young men then proceeded to practice catheterizing me through my urethra. And I've had to have procedures in adulthood to try and clear out the mess that was made. And it wasn't just that, it was the sexual abuse later on. I had chronic and constant urinary tract infections throughout my life, which weren't addressed. So, you know, I don't know what my mother was thinking, but I wasn't taken to the doctor for those. And then the experimentation. So at the age of 10, my father had just murdered a child in front of me, one that I had extensive interaction with, and who was also a high-profile missing child. He just murdered her, and I had escaped where it occurred, and I was out the front of my house, and he came and sat down. Well, I was already sitting down in trauma, and explained to me that I had been part of research, and that I was very important, and that it was going to bring out, and he actually described it as a zombie apocalypse, which sounds absolutely insane until you start to look into things like what the CDC have on their website, as in a zombie preparedness plan, and all of the doctors, including Luc Montagnier, who's a world-renowned Nobel laureate in virology, saying that these things that are happening now will likely bring out prion disorders, and prion disorders are often called zombie diseases. So I was utilised, according to my father, in the development of what he called at that time scrapie, but later on was named, or he let me know, was called Kuru, which was a prion disorder of the Papua New Guinean people. Whether or not it actually originated there or was taken there to be experimented on them, I have my personal beliefs, but it's supposedly a funerary cannibalism issue. Basically, he told me at age 10 that I'd been utilised. I'd already had a couple of attempts to infect me at that point. There was another attempt at age 14 where I was actually shown the tissue as it was placed into slits that had been placed in, cut into the inside of my throat. So there are certain ways they try to infect people. One was a lumbar punch at age 18 months, which I've got freedom of information documentation to prove that I had the lumbar punch, and names the doctors involved and the facility where it was done, but it doesn't actually say that Kuru prions were placed in me, but I've got proof that that did occur. And at age 14, yeah, that they also do tissue-to-tissue contact through the tonsils, and then they try to infect animals or whatever they're talking about in the medical research. So there are at least 3 attempts to infect me. Apart from some symptoms which may have been psychological in 2003, because I did find very difficult to walk at one point, lots and lots of shaking, that sort of thing. I've seen reasonably okay. So I don't think, maybe I've got something in me that makes me impervious to it. I don't know, but yeah, I haven't come down.
If I may, Rachel, I was put through not just, consistent raping, but all kinds of other torture with broken bones and stabbing and burning and, all of this stuff. And I was able to heal my own body. So there was some way that no matter what was done to me, I would heal it and come back from it. So I wonder if I actually believe all human beings have this ability. It's just been, we've been taught that our body, that there's an expert out here called a doctor and that it has to be a medicine from outside. That's not true. I know that's not true. So I think we all have this ability. It's just not necessarily online for all of us. But I would venture to say, and it would be really clear to me that, well, yeah, of course you could heal yourself.
I totally agree with you. Yeah. I went through so many processes. For instance, I had a knot in my shoulder, which was the size of a small egg, for several years. And it wasn't until I remembered that there was this particular incident, which was the same girl that I was mentioning earlier. Her arm was removed, and it was the same arm, and I was carrying a lot of grief about that because I was forced to witness it. So once the realization of that occurred and I asked for the healing, the pain went, and the muscle released finally, and had been in that knot for years. Like, it just wouldn't go away. It was, just considered a repetitive strain injury, but there was much consternation from doctors and rheumatologists as to why it wouldn't just relax.
Because what I would say is it's a memory.
Yes.
So our trauma, our memories are held in our mind, but just as much in our body. So, and it was her arm, right? So that would make a lot of sense. You carried that with you until you were able to release it.
And that was such a long-winded issue for me physically. I think, like you've just said, I came to a point where I could heal myself through that process. And that was actually during the time that I had this difficulty walking as well.
Yeah. So you mentioned satanic ritual abuse, which is something that, I was put through as well, and put through many different rituals. I suspect they use some of the same rituals on all of us. So if, again, I know this is really sensitive, information, and it's hard to be here and talk about it. If you're willing, would you describe some of the satanic rituals that you were put through?
Yeah, so at times I was given liquid to drink. So at times I think there was an enhancement of the experience, but I was psychically very, very open and trained to utilize those gifts. So I saw some things that people just would not be able to believe, or I couldn't possibly explain, but full-on manifestations, the chanting, often fire was used as a conduit. and children murdered, as and I believe now I understand it as the death process opens a portal, which then allows, and the energy release allows whatever it is that they're trying to manifest to utilize the energy and to manifest itself.
Yes.
It's interesting that these entities were never very happy about being conjured up, which was probably the thing that I found most frightening, was the anger and the seething hatred of these things when they had been called up, because in order to placate them, quite often someone else would be taken out during the ritual. Some were really very involved and seemed to be more about the cult members bonding than anything else, because they weren't necessarily entities brought up at those times. For instance, there was one where I was taken to a Tudor style lodge in the Adelaide Hills and sat at the end of a very, very long table with cult members at one end that were all observing me, myself, my father, and this other family member, whilst a waiter came in and was all over me like a rash. I was only 14 years old. I'd had to go shopping with one family, with the one that was present, family member, to get a special black and white dress, which was literally chunks of black and white in opposing positions, and so that, you know, it would be enticing to this horrible man who was all over me like a rash, this waiter, while all these weird people that I was terrified of were watching on from the other end of the table. And then after that, I was taken into a different room. It was dark. Symbols were painted or drawn on the ground, or on the floorboards, and then I was placed in stirrups, reclined with my legs in stirrups. I was naked, and then they would all come around, and they would either place a digit or the lower end into me, not in a very, it wasn't sexual, so it's really weird. And they would each all individually do that, and then I was married off to the waiter. I was just so incredibly strange and bizarre, and there were different pieces of clothing that were worn and items given. So that's one example as well. Then there was the one in the Adelaide Hills in outdoor location, which was a really big affair. So all of these little Boy Scouts were there originally. I was taken there by my father, and I was forced to sit behind the car seat, in the back of the car, passenger part of the car, behind the seat, down in the footwell, and a blanket put over me so that I couldn't see where we were going. And this was a regular thing that my father would do, so that I couldn't locate where we were. But it felt to me like it could be Belair National Park, which is a very well-known park down here. And these Boy Scouts helped to produce or create this big bonfire. Like, they didn't light it, but they got all the sticks together and they brought all this stuff in, and big logs, and it was huge. It was a really large group of detritus to burn. And then they left, and adults arrived, and some other children were sat next to me. So I had been given something at some point, so that I would just sit there compliantly. And we're all sat on these weird fold-out chairs. I won't go into it too much, but the chairs weren't sitting upright. We were actually sitting on the back of the chair on the ground. And my arms were tied to the arms of the chair that were kind of upside down, so I have to explain. There were about 10 other children who were all to my left, and each of us had a minder, someone with a hessian sack over their head. And I recognised my father's voice. I knew that he was my minder. And we're forced to watch this bonfire being burnt, all these adults dancing around, chanting, drums were playing, and then eventually, I won't go into it too deeply, but a child was produced, a small baby, was horrifically murdered, and he was injured somehow severely because of the screaming, but then placed on the bonfire that had burnt down to that point, so that it was hot, like, but at a lower level, because, you know, it was all glowing, and poor thing. I'll never forget the sound of that. So he died that way. And then my father took some of the flesh and tried to make me eat it. And I believe the other children were also forced, because I remember there was one boy who was vomiting, just vomiting constantly. I mean, the poor kid. And I'm yet to find those individuals. I've spoken about this a few times, and I just hope and pray that if any of them remember it, or if they've survived to this point, you know, please contact me.
Yeah. Wow, Rachel, that is so intense, so dark, and unfortunately so relatable to me. You know, I also was taken places with a blanket over my head in the car so I wouldn't see where I was going. I was put through a satanic ritual that sounds very similar, with a big bonfire outside somewhere. And I was also drugged like you. Instead of a baby being put on the fire, they threw live animals into the bonfire, while a long line of men was raping me while I was drugged and, you know, immobilized. So it's interesting to me to hear how similar your experience is. It's obviously these people really have a big imagination in the kinds of things that they do and what they're doing, you know, and making you eat the flesh. I think a lot of people who are watching this may feel fairly sick to their stomach just hearing about it. But I know that you know as well as I do, because I've witnessed this below the Vatican. I've witnessed children being cut open while alive and their blood drank and their organs eaten. So we know that these folks literally eat children as well as rape them and torture them. So I'm so sorry that you had to go through that horror, and you know.
Oh, likewise, Max, likewise.
Yeah, wow. So what was it like for you in your daily life? I know from my experience, there was almost like a separation. It was like a duality, right? Like a so-called normal life. You know, I went to school and blah, 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 but then this other life. So how was that for you?
It was a duality. So my mother was like the light in my life, and she kept things reasonably normal, but she was clearly miserable. She was just like a slave. I mean, she just constantly cleaned. That's all she did. She did have a garden, so that was her happy place. So she kept things, you know, bearable. But sadly, she left when I was 13. I was left alone with him at that point. So, but yeah, it was sort of a reasonably normal existence, I suppose, when these things weren't happening, except that I had these constant urinary tract infections and nightmares, and I did struggle at times, because the memories would come up and I would know that there was something very, very wrong, but then I would manage to repress it. And there were weird things going on with my siblings as well that just were very, you know, triggering, and obviously to remember things. And yeah, and my father's very, very erratic and strange and aggressive and just horrible behaviour. And he would always had this habit of trying to bring me back to his level and remind me of what was really going on in my life, with these little asides that he would make and these little comments. And, you know, he'd be normal 1 minute and then the next minute he would have that look, and that would remind me of what was really true. And just a temper like you wouldn't believe. Like, he would be all right, and then suddenly he would be throwing things, getting furiously angry about absolutely nothing. No apparent trigger. So you're constantly, I mean, I wouldn't say that I was ever relaxed. I was constantly looking over my shoulder. Yeah. And I had great terror of the supernatural as well. So I was terrified of the dark. I was claustrophobic because of the things that had been done to me. I had so many fears that I was constantly fighting against those fears. But the only thing that was really my saving grace, apart from my mother, was my friends. I got to go away and just spend weekends or nights at friends' places where it was normal. And that was just pure joy. Even though I had chronic homesickness, which sounds insane, but I was always worried that my mother would be murdered while I was gone, because that was his constant terror tactic was if I ever spoke about anything, she would be murdered.
Yes. Yes, I was told the same thing. And my mother was not as a good place as yours. She tried to kill herself over and over in my childhood, so which I saved her from. But just like your mom, you know, they were victims. They were helpless. They really had no power to do anything about this. No. And I have a daughter now. I can't imagine what it was like for your mom and my mom to watch and to know what their daughters were being put through and really not be able to do anything about it. I think it made my mother go crazy. And yeah, I'm so sorry. That's just awful. And you know, what you're talking about too with your dad is, I call it walking on eggshells, you know, never knowing, because both of our lives, you know, while we may have had moments, you know, like you had with your friends, for me, my saving grace was reading books and schoolwork. For some reason, I loved that. So we had these so-called normal times, and yet we knew that tomorrow or in an hour, something else was going to happen. Yeah. So as children, even as adults, but as children, it's so stressful. I remember I used to wake up every day and be a little bit disappointed that I was still here. I would think, oh no, you know, because it's that you know, the next thing is going to happen. It's going to come. And that itself is a torture. Yeah. So how was it so you're many decades past that now, as am I. And I would love to know, how has this affected you in your adult life, and how did you come back from it?
So my father died in 2017. I did manage to get some sort of investigation going into him after it took me about, I don't know how many years at that point, 12 years of trying to get authorities to investigate him. And I've got two siblings who've had similar abuses and have also made public allegations and formal allegations and complaints, which were never properly investigated. So we corroborate each other. I guess, how would I put it? I've managed to put a lot of it, since his death, I've managed to put a lot of it into compartments so that, you know, if I'm talking about it in an interview, and it's almost like a catharsis, or it's almost like therapy. I can't go to a psychologist or a psychiatrist because I don't trust them because of the abuse from the psychologist in my family. Yeah. So it's almost like these are my therapy sessions, and also getting together with other survivors. We'll talk about what we've done to cope, and you learn tips. But most of it was self-directed. So I'm very, very spiritual. I speak to, and I have to qualify that I don't hear voices. So I'm not schizophrenic, but I have a dialogue. That's probably a better way to put it, a dialogue with who I believe to be my spirit guides and my protectors daily. And that keeps me sane. And I'm constantly receiving information that is then verified in, you know, they might tell me something is going to happen, you know, in a certain period of time, and then it does. So I'm constantly feeling this reassurance that that dialogue is real, and it's more real than this physical reality that I'm living in at the moment, because I'm an infinite soul and an immortal soul having a human experience at the moment. This won't go on forever. Yes. And I also feel like I've gone through this process for a reason. It's not that it's happened to me, you know, with no reason. I actually believe I chose my parents. I chose my father on a soul level to be his child. So, and that realization, which I think I came to around about 2012, was a massive, massive release. I no longer felt like, oh, this terrible things have happened to me and it's so unfair, and why me and not anybody else. And suddenly it was that lifted, and it was like, oh, okay, so there's process, there's a reason, there's something that's going to come at the end of this that's going to make it not tolerable and not acceptable, but there's a process to it, and that I might one day look back and say, I'm not happy it happened, but I accept that it happened for a good purpose, and I believe that's happening now. So that good purpose is speaking out about it and trying to help other people go go through their own process of healing. So,
I agree. You're here right now, telling your story, and I completely agree with you. I too feel the same way, and not that I, would ever want to go through this again, but what I'm going to do with my experience, and what you're doing as well, is we're using it to expose this on planet Earth. This has happened to millions of children, millions. And so we went through it and we survived it. We're strong enough and we're courageous enough to speak out about it. That if we can stop this, then millions more children won't go through this. And I would consider that worth it for myself.
Yeah, beautifully put. Absolutely, 100%, Donna, absolutely. So I feel exactly the same way. Yeah, doesn't condone it, doesn't mean it can ever be allowed to happen to anybody else, because that's I always worry when I say that stuff like that. Will people then think, oh, it's okay to do it then? Yeah. Will these perpetrators then think that's fine? No, definitely not. And we're coming for you, and we are doing what we're doing because this is exposing you, and your days are numbered pretty much. And that's not a threat on them physically, that's a soul threat. That's right. Because we know where their souls go, and this is why they fight so hard while they're here, because they're going somewhere so dark where they'll be predated upon. And a dark soul's immortality is not guaranteed, whereas a light soul's immortality is.
Yes. And you mentioned this earlier, that during the rituals you observed that they're bringing in dark entities. I experienced that as well underneath the Vatican in the ritual murder of children on altars. I actually saw some beings that were not fully embodied appear. You could see sort of a shape, and they were just black, and their eyes glowed. And the feeling in me was a kind of a coldness that is the coldest cold that goes right to your bones that I could ever, it's hard to explain. Mm-hmm. So I want to second that yes, I really do believe they do these rituals to bring in power, because they're of the dark. They don't have that power that you and I have that comes from, you said your guides. I have the same thing. I used to talk to Jesus when I was a child. It doesn't really matter what the form is. It's that energy, right? Yeah. So we have this energy, but they don't, because they've severed that part of themselves. And so they bring energy in from the dark using, ritual sacrifice and all kinds of things like that. And I also heard you say sometimes it was just a bonding thing for them. It was just fun for them. And I totally agree with that too. I have been taken to these elite parties where they tell children to go hide on the grounds in the woods, and then they hunt them, and I've witnessed at these parties how bonding it is for them to hunt and rape the children, and they laugh and they drink. So I've seen that as well. They both do it as a kind of it cements their cult, right? Their group. And they also do it to bring in power and energy, dark energy, that they can then use. So I found that really interesting that you and I have both seen the exact same thing. It's, again, I'm so sorry you had to go through that. Is there anything else that you want to mention in terms of the abuse, the rituals, the connection? Because in my experience, the people that participate in this are members of what we would call the elite. So they are powerful people, wealthy people, people in, famous people. And so I don't know if there's anything you wanted to share more about that.
Well, it's interesting. My father's closest associates, as far as the cult was concerned, were just the body boys. So what my father was involved with, apart from his ASIO connections, was very low level, pathetic, really. And they were certainly not considered respectable by the other members of the cult, say, that were very high. I won't necessarily name them all, but the many doctors, for instance, but they were just according to the hierarchy, still quite low, the doctors, because they were still the minions. There were higher up members, just to describe it as in the lawyering type circles. I think my father felt very frustrated that he never had a title. I think that's part of the reason why he would explain to me and my one sibling in particular so many facets of what he was doing and what was going on, that we weren't always, we weren't privy to everything, but he would tell us everything. So I think he wanted this all to come out at some point, because he felt that he was very important, but he didn't have a title. So his mother had an Order of Australia medal, which is like an OBE. And which I totally distrust those sorts of titles now, because I know so many high up people have them who are really very dodgy, horrible people, cult members. Not all, but many. So it's interesting. I sort of tend to look at my father as low level, although he had clearance to do some pretty interesting things. I mean, he was supposedly in the Navy Reserves, though I cannot get any of his, I can't even get his ID number, which is really amazing. And they don't have any records, which people in there have told me, well, that means he was in ASIO. And I was with him one time. He took my mother and myself off to Port Adelaide to look at one of the ships that he used to be on. And he actually walked us through, and everybody knew him. They all knew his name. So he obviously did go on the ships, but he was in the submarines, which now I can understand from the Ghislaine Maxwell case is actually, so he might have actually been quite an important person, but the people he mixed with that they seem quite low level, like his best friends. And there's two of his friends now who are convicted pedophiles. One's been convicted 3 times now. My brother was involved with one of those, getting him convicted. That took years. It took 10 years to get this guy chased down and convicted. And he was, this perpetrator was funding orphanages in Cambodia. And my brother's considered a hero in that country, here as well, for having him taken out. And it just took so much effort on myself, my brother, and another sibling's part to have that man convicted. And obviously the very, very good police officer who finally did chase up. And there's another one now who's also a very close friend of my father, who's doing an 18-year sentence, which is extremely rare. Yes, you don't get sentences like that, especially in Australia normally. And this is a first offence, or first conviction, very, very unusual. So I think that's because he was actually covertly recording my father for years and helping us to a degree. Not me. I didn't have any connection with this person personally, but he was doing some sort of work to help, and I don't think that the higher ups were very happy about that, hence his 18-year sentence. Yeah,
that is very rare, because mostly the people doing this are at the level of presidents, politicians, Hollywood people, clergy, high up in the Vatican, high up in all the other churches. So normally these people don't even get tried, much less, convicted or sentenced. And so that is, I mean, it happens sometimes, but mostly so far it hasn't occurred. Yeah.
Well, and statistically, just so people know, in South Australia, there's one convicted pedophile for every, I think it's 760 or 780 members of society, which when you consider that they're very, very, very rarely convicted, it gives you a bit of an idea of just how bad it is here. And that's not unusual in Australia, but the other states as well.
Yeah. 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 Statistics are also really horrible. I remember I've always worked in my career with trauma survivors, and I think it was in the maybe late 80s or early 90s that the statistics on children who were sexually abused, I mean, we're not talking satanic ritual or trafficking, but just this was what was reported, right? They said 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys would be sexually abused by the time they got to the age of 18. Keep in mind, though, that's only what's reported. Most cases are not reported, and this data is decades old. So even with that, which is far lower than I think is actually the case, it's a staggering number and a staggering issue.
In Australia, it's 1 in 2 girls, 1 in 3 boys. Oh. And again, the reporting, and boys don't report. So it's probably a far, far higher percentage than the females of boys who are being abused. Yeah, it's just disgusting.
It's horrible. So I know that I was able to heal and come back from what happened to me, though, you know, I still struggle in different ways, even now, you know, in my adult life. And I was wondering, for you, are there after effects? Are there things that you still struggle with from having gone through that in your growing up years?
Yeah, so physically I seem to be okay. I don't have the recurring chronic issues with the lower body that I used to have. So I've healed a lot of that, I believe. There's weird things like I can't bear the feeling of my right hand over my left hand. I can't stand it. So I'm constantly, all day long, I'm constantly reminded of my abuse, because I'll absent-mindedly put my right hand on my left hand and I cannot bear the feeling of it. So that is an example of, because my father actually, with one child's murder, he actually placed the butt of a knife in my left hand and placed his hands around my hand to deal the death blow. And I just, it reminds me of it every time. So that's a constant everyday thing, which just drives me mental. But instead of getting angry like I used to, I just adjust myself. So it's just a constantly, but it's something that's, you know, it's such a simple thing that you do all the time. Yeah. So that's probably a very good example. Waking up in the morning is difficult. So mornings are always the hardest. But I have self-talk, and I have my very powerful spiritual beliefs, and I have, you know, this dialogue that I have with these entities that help me, that are loving light beings. And I have, I do a form of, it's not formal counselling, but I do a form of counselling with people on a daily basis as well, which is not self-taught. I sort of taught some of this stuff earlier. So it's psychic work. That also helps me to constantly tune in, which also gives me a heads up on, you know, dangers that might be coming and that sort of thing as well. So strangely, I feel quite safe. I even feel safe enough to say that, because something is keeping an eye on me and protecting me.
Yeah.
Otherwise I wouldn't be here. I've got a sister who's dead because of what she knew. Her mother, my three older half siblings, their mother was taken out because of what she knew. And of course, you know, all the children that I witnessed having died. But I'm still here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and it's interesting, you know, that the two siblings that also remember being abused by our father, they're still here. So, which is surprising, because, you know, they were witness to a particular case that was a very, very high level case that's known all over Australia, which is the Beaumont children going missing. So it's, you know, it's really amazing that they're still here, and they are. Yeah. So I just have to go every day believing that protection is there. Yeah.
I think it is. I feel that I have had that protection as well. And, you know, we're meant to survive and be here. So I think so we can tell our story and help end this practice. I have another question for you. I'm curious about, you know, when these kinds of experiences, they're not just horrific and terrifying. They're outside of what should even exist. They're just so outside of the norm. They're so powerful in a dark way that I was wondering if you had repressed some of it and then have it come back later, or if you always remembered what you went through. Some
I repressed until later. Some of those memories only started coming up years ago. Some are still coming up. So, you know, there's still stuff there. There was an underground facility that I was taken to. So I've only just started to remember some of the stuff where I was trained with weapons as a young teenager, but I wouldn't kill. So then it got swapped, and that training swapped into, they wanted me to be a psychologist. And that's a whole convoluted story where I was gifted a Bachelor of Science degree where I was actually given the entry even though I didn't have the grades. And I've got transcripts to prove that I didn't have the grades in year 12, but I got in, and I was told all I had to do, I didn't even have to put pen to paper, I just had to turn up to the exams and I would have my psychology degree at the end of those years. But I opted out. I didn't want to do it because I knew I was getting into a trap, and that mentoring is something that's very common. So the cult can then control you. Well, you got qualifications, you know, in a clandestine manner. We now can control you. God knows what they would have got me to do in that situation. So I know there's still memories that have to come up about that underground facility. And that there was a child that I was taken to see, or a young man who was in dire straits in that facility. Yeah, so
I think that's very common. It's almost impossible to hold this level of trauma and not sort of fragment it. And in my understanding of my own journey, you know, I split things off as well. I also remembered some things as well, just like you. And around my early 40s, I had my daughter at age 39. And after that, a lot of the other memories started to just kind of fly back in. So I think they come back when we're ready, little by little, in a way that we can sort of tolerate it. And something I find interesting is also, you were talking about your hand, right? It's even when we don't remember something, we do remember it, our body remembers it. When I was 14, because of the raping, I was impregnated and I was given a ritualized abortion when I was about 6-7 months along, and the infant was then killed in front of me. That actually happened twice. So when I did not, I repressed that, right? I did not remember that until after my daughter was born, but my body remembered, because when I was giving birth, I was in labor for about 24 hours and then pushing for 4 hours, and she would not come out. And there was no reason for her not to come out. She just wouldn't. I ended up having to have a cesarean section. And then, you know, I was in the little room with her, and the nurse took her to, you know, they do the checkup and bathe the baby and all that. And when she was taken from me, I started to scream in a panic and cry. And I was saying, and my husband was in the room with me, and I was saying, you know, they're killing her, they're killing her. So he, you know, he ran to get her. I didn't remember that incident, but I believe my body just didn't want to let her out, because the last time that the last couple of times that happened, the baby was killed, right? So it's so interesting what our subconscious holds and does. And, you know, when she was taken, I assumed she was being killed. I didn't even know why I was saying that at the time. The memory came back later. So our psyche is, I think, very clever in how we can hold these things and still survive and go forward. And at certain pivotal times, some of those memories come back. And so I call my show Returning to Self, because I believe that's what we can become whole again. We just have to recover all these pieces that got, you know, put away and put here and there. And so what you're saying is, you know, you're still on that journey. Things are still coming back to you, which, yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. It would be impossible to survive and hold that all in our conscious awareness.
I'm so sorry that happened to you, darling. That's just horrific.
Yeah.
I had forced abortions too, but they weren't very far along.
Oh, you too, huh?
Poor darling.
Yeah. Well, Rachel, I am so moved by your story. I'm thank you so much for being willing to come here today and to talk about the things that we talked about. I think this is going to be difficult but important for people to hear about. And before we end, is there anything else that you want to say as we close this out?
One thing that with this crazy situation that we're all going through at the moment, and the exposure and the awakening and everything that's happening, I truly believe we're coming into a golden age of humanitarianism. I really believe that, and I think that's the only reason why I've gone through this in this lifetime, to be here now, to be speaking about it now, is because we are ushering in this golden age. And the only way to do that is to eradicate what's now holding, or was holding, sway over all the rest of us.
Yes.
And yeah, I'm so heartened, because obviously, you know, my experiences were nowhere near the Vatican, and you are an incredible survivor to have gone through that and still be here, because I know psychics who've told me what's under there and how horrific it is. And just to hear from an actual survivor is amazing. So I'm looking forward to actually watching your stuff now. So I came into this quite blindly. What's coming is amazing. It's worth sticking around for.
Yeah. I 100% agree with you, Rachel. You know, just the same way that in our personal lives, we were fragmented and the pieces were repressed and held in different places to go forward. I think collectively as a human species, that has occurred too. The trauma has fragmented all of us. And I agree with you. I think that now is a time for everything to become whole again and to go forward in a completely new way. And so I so appreciate you being here today and helping us take another step towards returning to that wholeness. So thank you so much, Rachel. And I look forward to talking to you again in the future if you're willing to do that.
Oh, absolutely. I'd love to. Thank you so much.
Thank you.